My name is Akili Tommasino, and I am Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. I curated the MFA's presentation of Lucian Freud, The Self-Portraits, which traces the development of the British painter's art through the singular lens of self-portraiture, featuring 45 works executed on canvas, paper, and etching plate by Lucian Freud, spanning the 1940s until a few years before his death in 2011. The exhibition was on view to the public from March 1st until the MFA's coronavirus-induced closure on March 13th. It is my pleasure to speak today with a living master of figurative painting, Brooklyn-based artist Jas Knight, about the role of self-portraiture in his practice, his technique, and how the present moment is impacting his art. Jas, to begin, let's talk a bit about your background. You're currently based in Brooklyn, but were born and raised in Connecticut. Like Lucian Freud, who exhibited drawings in group gallery exhibitions as a child, your talent for drawing was recognized at an early age. You sold your first painting at age 7 and had your first solo exhibition at age 8. Could you talk about your formal artistic training in Philadelphia and your development since moving to New York, as well as how you would currently describe your practice?
Okay. The artist who I apprenticed with in high school, after I had asked him, should I go to Philadelphia and study, said that he thought it was a good idea. So on his word, I traveled to Philadelphia to study at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which was the school that Thomas Eakins in the 19th century had a huge impact on in terms of the curriculum. At the time, the study of painting would have started with studying etchings, then drawing from the cast, and then painting from the model. But Thomas Eakins innovated by having students right from the start work in all of those mediums. Like, so you would have been doing drawing from the cast along with painting from the model. And so, well, I should mention that Thomas Eakins was the student of the artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was a 19th century painter that I was under the spell of at the time. And so I felt a connection because I couldn't study with Gérôme. At least I could study at the school that his student had gone to, had set up the curriculum essentially. And along with the fact that Henry O. Tanner had attended the Pennsylvania Academy, and Henry O. Tanner being, along with Charles Ethan Porter, the only two Black American artists that had an academic art training. Charles Ethan Porter having studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, being funded by the well-known writer Mark Twain. And he was also a resident of Hartford, which is where I was born. So I felt an affinity with this school, the Pennsylvania Academy, and I got my degree from the University of the Arts. I still keep in contact with a teacher from the Pennsylvania, my prospective teacher from the Pennsylvania Academy. So the school itself was, it was, I guess you could say it was very, it was very instrumental in my formative development, is what I would say. It was, and it has a history. It has a history that goes well back into the kind of painting that I am involved with even today.
And when did you leave Philadelphia for New York?
Okay, so I left Philadelphia for New York several years after graduation. So for a long time, I actually lived in Philadelphia, more or less starving, trying to figure out how to make a living as an artist. I was always quite determined that I would make a living as a painter, and it wouldn't be a hobby. And I said pretty early on, my mother recalled me as a child at the age of 5 or 6 saying, my stuff's going to be in museums. I'm going to be doing paintings of important people and so forth. And so after graduating from school, even though I was poor and I didn't have many resources, I was determined to make a living painting. And so I painted in penury for many years before I said many years, maybe 4, 5 years before moving to work as an artist assistant here in New York. And then I quit that job eventually because it was impossible to really create the kind of work I wanted to make working there. And now, yeah, I live and work in Brooklyn. And if you ask me how I'm doing it, I don't know. I just sort of following that North Star, so to speak.
And how would you describe your work now? What do you do?
Well, my work primarily consists in me painting portraits of friends, various New Yorkers, and occasionally some genre painting and some still life painting occasionally too. So actually right now I'm working on a series of genre paintings that are based in what I had a trip I took to Senegal in late last year.
Mm-hmm. Lucian Freud stated, quote, "My work is purely autobiographical. It's about myself and my surroundings. I work from the people that interest me and that I care about and think about in rooms that I live in and know." What motivated you to focus on the human figure, and when are you typically motivated to produce self-portraits?
Well, I feel like human beings we're generally intrigued by depictions of ourselves. Um,
Mhm.
and you'll see this this will be something you'll see in the smallest child. And I think that it might have to do with the fact that we learn to read our environment a lot of times through a person's face. And I'm not exempt as an artist, and almost no one is exempt from that. So this is more of a thing that is a result of intuition, but I feel like it's something that is shared across humanity. You'll have people who have gotten into still life, or they'll get into landscape or and so on. But primarily, if you think of the people who are known in our culture as the titans of art, are usually people who dealt with human beings, and because there's so much of a story to be told just in a face sometimes. So yeah, I feel like I've gravitated toward that for the same reason, because the heroes that I have, they depicted human beings primarily. This is not to say that a person like Chardin, for instance, didn't influence me on some level through his still lifes, but I believe, I believe the human figure has been predominant in art in general, particularly in the art of oil painting, for sure.
Mhm. Let's talk about technique. Lucian Freud, for example, didn't typically undertake preparatory sketches for his works. As one can see in his unfinished self-portrait from about 1956, he would draw a loose outline in charcoal and build up the image directly with paint. He started with the face and worked outwards from the center. Could you break down your process of painting a figure into steps? Do you paint from life or photography, and how does that choice determine how you go about executing one of these works?
Okay. Earlier on, I used photography more frequently than I do now. Um, this was it was largely pragmatic. It had to do with just availability. When you can't afford to hire models and so forth, and you're interested in painting people, you will very likely use photos, or you'll have to work from your imagination. But as time is going on, I find myself working nearly exclusively from life, and this often requires hours with the model, sitting on the model stand, and I'll do drawing. Sometimes I'll do preparatory drawings. That's been less the case recently. I usually do some sort of oil study, but often that is done with oil paint. I'll rough the drawing in, essentially with some umber, and then begin to paint on top of this oil drawing, essentially. So that's the process. Sometimes I'll use vine charcoal. That happens. And I build it in. I work in layers, essentially. So I'm not an alla prima painter or premier cool painter, a person who paints it in one sitting. I'm a painter who does a painting in stages that are based in the model's availability, essentially. So sometimes they will go on for months, sometimes they'll go on for weeks, but generally speaking, they are things that I work on over a period of time.
And when are you motivated to do self-portraits?
Oh, and as far as self-portraits, I find self-portraits to be a place that I can really examine theories that I have about oil paint, and or I should say, be more specific so that's understandable. Theories I have about perception and the translation of perception on a canvas. And the reason why a self-portrait is the ideal vehicle for that examination is because a self-portrait is not relying on a model and the model, the whims of a model, if you will. And so that I have myself for, as long as I am willing to sit, I can paint. Which makes it ideal vehicle. Like I say, I think many of the great painters of the past have done self-portraits, and I'm beginning to believe that it was largely because of that element, the fact that you have a readily available model, although there are drawbacks. There are certain things that, for instance, the painter is often painting with the hand that he's depicting. So these are things that you're going to, maybe I should slow down here and say that most painting, in fact, all painting and drawing is based in memory on some level, but the self-portrait presses that point even further, because as you take a look at yourself in the mirror, then you have to step forward to paint it. You don't have the direct comparison of just standing back and seeing both your model and the piece that you're working on simultaneously. You actually have to step forward and remember what you saw and then document it, and then step back and hope that the two are more or less aligned. So in that sense, it is a little bit more of a challenge, but for the con of that, or the challenge of that, you have the pro of being able to work endlessly on the self-portrait. I am working on one now. I'm working on at least 2 self-portraits right now. And that's, you can let one dry and the next day pick the other up. And this is ideal in a time like now, like quarantining, et cetera.
Yeah, executing a self-portrait is also a safe way to social distance, right?
Yeah, exactly. Ideal social distancing, yeah.
Jas, let's talk some more about technique and its implications for style. You are an exceptional draftsman and painter, so a double threat. Drawing and painting competed for Freud's attention at different points in his career. Devotion to drawing was the basis of Freud's early mature style, and emphasis on line undergirds his first major self-portrait, Man with a Feather of 1943, for example. By the late 1940s, Freud's drawings proper feature an increasing graphic sharpness. When, in the mid-1950s, Freud switches from soft sable hair brushes to broader hog's hair, whose bristles are capable of handling a heavier load of paint, he makes loose painterly marks and abandons drawing altogether for several years, making a return to the medium of drawing in the 1980s via etching. Have you experienced any similar technical breakthroughs? And would you describe drawing and painting as a dichotomy or continuum in your art?
I don't tend to dichotomize painting and drawing. I think of painting as simply drawing with color. And in this view, if you're a poor draftsman, then you're going to end up being a poor painter. So I guess what seems to be being described in Freud's case, even if he may have described it as painting versus drawing, it seems to be a line approach versus a mass approach. And you might pit someone like Hals against a person like Raphael for that. Hals being a person who's more mass oriented and isn't afraid to let you see the pentimenti in his drawing. That is the sort of ghost of what he was, his perception as he was documented on a canvas. He'll sometimes let that show through, which is an earlier stage of a painting, as opposed to a person like Raphael, who would carefully work out in a linear approach, work out all the lines and more or less fill in the lines. I guess a less technical way of saying this would be to think of the old coloring books that people would use as children, where you would have lines and then you would fill to the page 2 lines in order to get an image. Well, linear painters tend to do that, or they tend to describe form and their sense of perception using lines, like very distinct lines. Whereas a person who's thinking in terms of masses, they're thinking in terms of shapes more or less and shifting them around until they get what they, but both approaches are equally valid. Let me rephrase that. I don't know if they're equally valid because obviously I lean toward one more than the other, but I would say that both of them are an equally approaching art. They just represent maybe opposite ends of the spectrum. And what you see in Freud, for instance, the way I would assess his development would be to say that he started off more linear in his approach and he ended more mass oriented in his approach. And mass being the way I tend to approach things myself.
Lucian Freud once stated that he liked the, quote, anarchic idea of coming from nowhere, of having no artistic forebears, but developing a purely individual style. However, as his career developed, it became clear to Freud, first and foremost, that he had a deep affinity for certain historically important European so-called old master painters, such as Rembrandt and Velázquez, as well as the 19th century painter Cézanne. Their influence is especially felt in Freud's self-portraits, which address existential questions about the construction of the self and the negotiation of intimate space. Jas, you're a big fan of Old Master and 19th century painting in particular. You brought up several names already thus far in the conversation, from Henry Oswald Tanner to Francis Hollis just now. You advocate for the practice of young artists making copies of historical paintings. You've even recently written a manual on Old Master copies. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about who are the historical painters you most admire and why is it important for you to make copies?
Okay, yeah. I believe it was the artist, the musician, Bill Evans, who stated, so I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of that many musicians of his day, and he was referring specifically to the free jazz movement, were when they would come to study piano with him, were after a degree of novelty in their playing, and they weren't really interested in the old stuff. And Bill Evans described that as an attempt to circumvent the great problems in music. And I feel like his succinct way of addressing that in music is applicable to painting. I feel like a lot of painters, so for me, painting is a form of communication, just like language, just like mathematics or anything. And I feel like there are basic tools when it comes to painting that, if when embraced, they enable a person to communicate more effectively. And this is why you mentioned the so-called old masters, that's an interesting and an important way of phrasing it, I guess. But because this particular idiom, as it were, was developed in a specific place, many of the advances that were made in the medium, I should say, were made hundreds of years ago. And I addressed this in my book that I wrote. I guess is a plug. It's a plug. The Art of the Master Copy, by saying that people tend to buy into certain fallacious suppositions about the way art is made and what is important. And one of them is that the accident of one's own contemporaneity makes their art more important than that which preceded it. And for me, the past is definitely a thing that should be studied, if for no other reason than for the fact that all of the great problems of perception have been addressed on some level by someone prior to me. And I would be somewhat of a narcissist to assume that by, again, accident of my contemporaneity, I am brighter than all the souls that came before me. So with that reasoning in mind, I feel like it's it is the duty of artists to study those who came before, just so, if for no other reason than to make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel, as they say. You want to make sure that if you are breaking new ground, it is new ground that you're breaking. Often it isn't. And I think if people get rid of these fallacies, these presuppositions about what it is that, or about even the importance, the import of novelty as a thing, like the idea that progress is chronologically linear. As these are all fallacious ideas, I believe, and I believe that the artists would do well to study and not just try to circumvent those problems, but study them and see how they were wrought and work through, and then maybe they might contribute something new moving forward. But the goal of great art isn't necessarily novelty. Novelty is incidental to your individuality, and this is a byproduct of you just being a human being. The goal of a great artist is to produce great art.
Great. So that's exactly one of the things I love about your work, is that it evinces your admiration of certain historical painters, but it is wholly contemporary. Your subjects tend to be young people of color, so the vibrant community your portraits collectively depict is one vastly different from the communities commemorated in old master paintings, or by Lucian Freud for that matter. Moreover, the built environments that your subjects occupy and the objects that they handle and that surround them are distinctly of our time. I'm especially thinking of your really great paintings of women beautifully lit by the glow of their cell phones or computer screens. How would you describe the contemporaneity of your work despite the historical origins of your technique?
Okay. I guess in some sense I've sort of answered a little of that, but to further elaborate on it, I believe that the contemporaneity of the figures, of the scenes that I depict, it is a necessary result of me just reflecting the era I live in. It's basically an accident of circumstance. And it's never a thing that I go out of my way to exaggerate. I tend to just try to, well, let's say it this way. If I were now doing a historical painting, a painting like, for instance, I did a commission for Yale University, and I had to paint James Pennington, who was the first Black student there, even though he wasn't recognized during that time as being such. I found a throne chair that was specific to that period and purchased it somewhere in Connecticut for the portrait, because I wanted, and I went through the work of trying to find costume that was appropriate to that period. So I'm a contemporary painter, and if I'm painting a scene that is contemporary, it's going to include things like devices like cell phones, etc. But if it's a scene that is historic, then I feel like it is my duty, in the way of maybe Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema or something, to do the actual research to make sure that it is historically accurate. And I guess we could even refer to Jerome, who went to painstaking kind of trouble to make sure that he could make the paintings he was making of ancient Rome, et cetera, or even if you were painting something in the Middle Ages, make it accurate. So I guess I would say that the art is a great thing in that it can lift a person. When you look at the works of Shakespeare, or if you look at the works of Homer, these are things that there are timeless messages in them, although they might reflect very idiosyncratic elements of a particular culture and particular time. There are things that you can draw from them and apply them to people throughout the ages. And that's one of the beautiful things about art. So an artist who's a contemporary painter he doesn't bear the burden of, I said he or she doesn't bear the burden of just trying to reflect what is going on around. At least these are my beliefs. They just bear the burden of trying to communicate beauty to everyone. And when I say everyone, I don't just mean their contemporaries. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of 500 years from now. Is the beauty that I'm communicating in the canvas going to be relevant to a person 500 years from now? And the devices by which which I use to communicate that with aren't shouldn't be an impediment to that. So a person who sees it 500 years from now should still be able, just like if I look at a Vermeer or something, you know, the fact that they wore a particular kind of corset or something shouldn't take away from my ability to appreciate the aesthetics of the piece. I don't know if that sufficiently answers it or if it's too verbose, but I felt like
No, I
could
think
just.
that's great. It's a perfect way of, I mean, to put it succinctly, you look back to look forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Jas, what's it like to be an artist in New York at this time? New York is the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. How are you coping with the present state of affairs in the world more broadly? And when we spoke a few weeks ago, you commented that shelter in place is the essential condition of an artist confined to his or her studio. Has this period of confinement affected your art? And if so, how?
Well, I was speaking to a friend fairly recently, and I said, if this virus were to take me down, I still think that it's wrought a greater good, and that it's purged the market, if only temporarily, of vapid, superficial work that has been produced in an industrial manner that's dependent on large groups of people and people without talent. And you know, I guess we could speak of what it's done in terms of just purging nature in some ways, and the good for animals and for the planet. But so that's been how I've thought of this. And yes, the artist is often working in their studio, but what I would consider the true artists, the true visual artists, are still able to produce, because it's never some sort of factory that's really that's really fueling the production of the work. And so for me personally, it hasn't changed much outside of the ability to walk outside to the local art supply store and get linen, or to get you know, right now I need some watercolor brushes that I can't get right now. Well, I guess I can order them, but there's a bit of a, you know, lag in getting supplies, because you have to anticipate what you're going to need ahead of time. But aside from that, I've been able to produce. And with, again, you have the setback of not having the models readily available that you had before the lockdown. But yeah, I feel like overall this is sort of good for art, because it is almost as though the art market, I felt, was kind of gloated with superficiality and market concern. And this is at a time like right now, if you're a real artist, this is the time that you can really delve into that which you already really love, for no other purpose, no market. You know, there isn't much of a market for anything. But you can do it for the love of the art, which is that's the reason why I started painting and drawing as a little child, you know. And I think this is good for the world of art overall. So I don't know if that's really a real answer direct, but that's a note I like to end on for sure.
Thank you to everyone for tuning into our conversation. Now we're going to open it up for a Q&A. If you're watching on Instagram or YouTube, please leave your questions for me and Jas in the comments, and our colleagues will pass them along to us. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question in advance. We'll start with those. So we had a question about what's currently on your easel right now, Jas.
Oh, okay. Well, first I should clarify what I meant earlier on in the talk about some of my predecessors, that is Black American painters. I think I said something along the lines of, there weren't any academically trained ones other than Charles Ethan Porter and Henry Tanner.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I should clarify, I was referring primarily to 19th century painters and people whose career was characterized by working in the particular idiom of academic art, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very narrow definition, basically. So, but there's Lou Sloan, who was the teacher of Barton Hendricks. They both went to the Pennsylvania Academy. There's Edmonia Lewis, who was a sculptor who later went to Rome and had a whole career. There's Augusta Savage, who's academically trained here. I believe she went to Cooper Union. She was trained here in New York. So there were Black artists who came before me and the current generation of academic artists worked in this particular tradition. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. As for what's going on,
what you're referring to really is systematic exclusion of those artists from opportunity, not a lack of desire for academic training or qualifications or anything like that.
Yeah, you said that much better. Basically, yeah, I was referring to the fact that these academies often were segregated. And a lot of Black artists weren't afforded the ability to be trained in them, with a few exceptions, like Henry O. Tanner and Charles Ethan Porter, they both studied in France. They didn't study, well, Henry O. Tanner may have studied for some time at PAFA, but he later became basically an expatriate due to exclusion and racism here in America. Mm-hmm. Just to clarify that. As far as what's going on my easel, I'm working on a self-portrait that you can see off in the distance here. I have, on my wall, the master copies, and there's.
Could you show it to us a little closer?
A portrait, or
yeah.
Okay, just a second.
You're working on that right now, right?
Yeah, it's. I would say I'm maybe in my first quarter of it, so I'm gonna see how I can do this without any. But I'm using both natural light and artificial light for this. And really, I'm still I've just gotten past the basic blocking of the drawing, mm-hmm. and I'm filling it in gradually. But
that's a nice almost Freudian stance you have there, the pose.
Yeah, I like the idea of, well, because I can't paint other people right now, mm-hmm. I like the idea of exploring painting myself, and I didn't want it to be just super boring, and I wanted to get into a lot of some of the theories that I have about color, and I felt like a good way to do that would be to paint myself more or less shirtless or something. It's not some exercise in vanity. It's more an attempt at exploring the way you would depict color on human skin, on Black human skin here, using the theories that I've kind of developed. So that's pretty much that. But yeah, I'm working on that. And I have a whole bunch of other paintings that are leaning against the wall, some of which may survive, some which may not, and in the closet, But
that's a great transition. We have a question about techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a 3-part question from the same person. They want to know what techniques you use for your underpaintings. Can you talk about color mixing, and how do you prepare your canvas for painting?
Yeah, sure. So canvases, I've moved away from pre-stretching canvases because a lot of my compositions, although I do studies for elements of the paintings, I don't tend to work it all out exactly like I'm going to work it out on the actual canvas. So I leave it. I would say I have a malleable approach to painting, which enables me to, if I need to extend a painting, I can do that. If I need to shrink it, I can do that, because I haven't committed to the parameters of the painting prior to painting it necessarily. I don't want to speak this. I'm speaking in generalities. This is not specific to every painting. Sometimes I have a very specific idea that I just more or less blow up. But these days, I'd like to have a certain degree of freedom. So a lot of times I will tape linen to foam core or some wooden board, and I'll paint on that. And as I see the composition's parameters developing before my eyes, I will then buy the stretcher frame and then stretch it. In terms of the approach, often it begins with an imprimatur. I often start on a tone ground. It's usually gray. And so you'll have a tone ground that's an oil prime piece of linen, and then an imprimatur that's a mixture of raw umber, usually, and ivory black. And then I begin to paint on top of that. But not always. Sometimes I'll, depending on the effects and how brilliant I want the color to look, I might exclude the imprimatur because it has a tendency to make things more dull. Trying to remember everything the person said. They asked about the palette. In terms of my palette, I used to use a somewhat limited palette, meaning that they have what they call a Zorn palette, which is essentially white, often lead white, yellow ochre, vermilion, and ivory black. So it's essentially 4 colors. And I, for a long time, worked using that palette primarily with an addition of burnt sienna or English red and cobalt blue. Sometimes alizarin crimson, I'm not keen on it because it's a fugitive pigment. That means it tends to fade with exposure to light quite easily. Now I use a fairly extended palette of, should I run down the list? I'll run it down real quick. I'll use white, a cad yellow, a cad red or vermilion. Then I'll use a cad orange, and I'll use a green, and I'll use purple. I'm just giving you the generic names for these things. Then I'll have tertiary colors of yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and I'll have raw umber, and then I'll have Mars black and ivory black. So with that array of colors, I can usually, I don't know if I mentioned cobalt, but cobalt's in there too. So I'll usually be able to achieve what I need to with those colors. I use a fairly simplistic medium. It's usually just linseed oil, or I'll paint directly with the paint. And I'm writing a book on color theory for artists.
This is separate from your project on, for your recently published book on the art of the master copy, right?
Yes, yes. This is I enjoy writing, and I figure instead of talking the ears off of friends who are often not artists or who don't care about these subjects, it's best to just write them down. It helps me to articulate them better, and it also might be of some use to artists who are interested in these sorts of things. So yeah, the next volume is probably going to take quite a deal longer than the master copy volume that I wrote. Is going to be on color. So it's requiring a little research. Joseph Albers and stuff, who actually wrote a good volume on color too. But I don't know. I think I've answered every question. They said it was 3.
Yes, yes. I think you answered that quite roundly.
Okay.
So here's a fun question. Do you paint with music or in silence? And if with music, what music do you listen to?
I mostly.
Bill Evans, maybe?
What'd you say?
Bill Evans, maybe?
Oh, no. I happen to be a musician myself, and I find that music is somewhat of a distraction for me because when I start listening to music, I usually begin my day at about 5:21 is when I wake up usually, and I'll practice most days for about 2 hours before I start to paint. And I try to
practice the piano?
Practice piano.
Wow.
Usually practicing mostly bebop, which is a form of jazz, or Bach, which is usually a fugal piece. I like Bach's music. So when I get that out of the way, so to speak, I don't want to be, I often don't want to listen to anything that's
It's too intense of an activity.
Yeah,
right?
I start like visualizing, playing the keys or whatever. It just ends up being very distracting. So often I find it quite helpful to listen to something that's almost silly to kind of not take myself too seriously. So sometimes I'm listening to anything from, it could be the silliest pop, like it could be DJ Academics. I listen to all kinds of just stuff, and hopefully seeing some of the threads of continuity, even between, if I'm listening to a book, an audio book, like a critique of Pure Reason by Kant or something. I love the idea of juxtaposing that with listening to DJ Academics or something. So yes, that does go down. I will listen to like Joe Budden or somebody on the heels of listening to something like Kant.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so there's a question here. Does the MFA own any of your work? And I am elated to be able to take that on and say that the MFA will be acquiring a painting by Jas Knight just this week, this coming week. And the painting is entitled Lumumba's Harp. It's from 2012, and it pays homage to the first democratically elected prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, whose parabolic tale of ascendancy from relative obscurity to prominence and subsequent assassination resonated with Jas. In this really virtuosic still life, Jas Knight assembles historical objects from various cultures in Central and West Africa, alluding to Lumumba's Pan-Africanist vision, as well as the continuity of the story of colonization on the continent and worldwide. You can find an image of this work if you go to the MFA's website and look for the latest press release. This just came out on Friday. Excellent timing. It's a really beautiful painting. I'm thrilled that it'll be entering the collection. So I'm really, really happy about that.
Yeah.
Move on to another question. This is from a visitor, a former, or an MFA community member, I should say. Jas, your work is amazing. Could you tell your story about the first time you were introduced to art?
My earliest memory of an introduction to art, I'm assuming they're saying, well, you know, I'll just, yeah. My earliest memory, my father, he was a draftsman. He was an architect, and he also drew. Did creative drawings, that is. And I just remember him teaching me the basics of how to draw a human head. At this time, I was about 4 years old or something, maybe even a little younger. But I do remember specifically because I couldn't do what he was trying to teach me how to do, and I remember crying because I couldn't do it. And but I eventually did learn how to do it. I don't know how long, you know, time always seems a lot longer when you're a kid than it does when you get older. So within, I guess, a short period of time, I grasped the lesson that he had taught me and began, you know, to become more creative and work daily. I worked, my father would throw out a stack of drawings every month because he said after a while there were too many drawings in the room and we couldn't house them. So he would just take, I don't know how large the stack was, but I know that I didn't play. All I did is draw. So I didn't like play games and play with toys. I mainly drew. And
you had
so
you had a solo show pretty early on too, right?
Yeah, when I believe I was 7 or 8, I had my first solo show. I sold my first painting at 7. I think the show was at 8, but I was working pretty regularly. I mean, all I did was draw, and you know, a little bit later started playing piano, and that's
so your father encouraged you. Your father encouraged
me. Yeah. In fact, punishment for me was literally you have to go outside and play. Because if they said you have to stay inside, I was perfectly happy. That's why this quarantine life, I don't, you guys are complaining about quarantine and taking guns to the state house so you can get a haircut and get outside. I don't care. I frankly don't care. I'm totally happy.
This is the mode.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. My mother, I do remember her taking me to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which was the major museum in Hartford. And I remember—
I think it's the oldest museum in the U.S., or one of the oldest museums in the U.S., I believe so.
I remember going there. I remember being in the corridor the first time I went there. And I remember at that point, I had already made my mind up that this is what I was going to do for a living. Yeah, so I do remember that.
Okay, so another question, is novelty an important value for an artist to strive for in order for his or her work to be recognized as significant?
I feel like I addressed that in the video, but the scholar Albert Boehm, he talks in his book, the Academy in French Painting in the 19th Century. He speaks about the emergence of novelty as a desirable thing in the 19th century. Prior to that, painting and visual art, particularly two-dimensional art, or I guess you could say even three-dimensional art, was based in tradition more. And so there were these traditions, the historical painting, etc., and it was a very structured thing. And somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, that all shifted, and the artists, the whole conception of what our conception, our contemporary conception of what a fine artist is, has been shaped by what happened in the middle of the 19th century. And